In my second year of med school, I had an exam in 2 weeks with 1.5 years of content to cover for it. This was obviously not ideal, but if you're in uni, you'll know that being behind is the natural state of life. The thing is though that after a very stressful 2 weeks, I was able to get a high distinction on that exam and I didn't do anything insane to do it. In this video, I'll share with you the strategy that I used to cover all of that content and show you how you can apply it to your own life. Let's get straight into it with the first key principle, which is that you need to pick your losses. When you're behind on your coursework, you're obviously not in a good position. You need to understand that you're not going to be able to catch up if you're not willing to make sacrifices somewhere. If you fell behind because you were partying non-stop, you can't expect to continue partying and still get 100%. But in the same way, if you start studying a lot, you can't really expect to go to the same amount of social events. My point in saying this isn't to say that one decision is better or worse than the other, but that you need to be intentional with the sacrifices that you're choosing to make. Otherwise, life will just make those choices for you. But there's more to this because it applies to how you choose to cover content as well. If you have limited time available to you, you're not going to be able to cover every single thing in the course to 100% detail. When you're studying, you have to be careful in what you're choosing to study because you simply cannot cover everything. This is linked to the second principle, which is that you need to learn to let go. If you do happen to be behind on uni, there are probably a lot of reasons that might have contributed to it, and you're probably feeling bad about it. You can beat yourself up about the fact that you procrastinated too much, or that you partied too much, or that you just never bothered to do your work. All of these are valid reasons to be upset, but the truth is that if you're behind, and there's nothing you can do to change the past. All you can really do is focus on doing the work that you can and putting yourself in a better position than you were the day before. So now you might be wondering, how do I actually catch up? Regardless of what you're studying, there'll be a collection of ideas that make up the majority of the marks on the exam. The secret is that if you were able to figure out what these concepts were and learn them really quickly, you'd be able to study for the exam in so much less time. This is all backed up by the Pareto principle, which states that 80% of the results for anything come from 20% of the efforts. So how do you find the 20% of content you need to study? Well, the first step is the most important, and it's the scope you're learning. You want to imagine that you're a bird looking down on all of the information you want to cover. You want to be able to visualize the biggest ideas and how everything fits together. When I was studying for this exam, I got some very basic summary slides and created a small mind map of how everything fit together. The next step builds on this, and it's sort of like a compass that points you in the right direction. At this stage, you should have some context on what can be assessed, so now you want to hone in on what comes up most in your exams. The way I did this is I got a practice exam and I pulled it up alongside my summary slides and tried to figure out what content was coming up most. When you do this, make sure that you don't look at the answers under any circumstances. I'll explain why a little bit later, but just trust me on this for now. This is the point where you can start learning the content in a bit more depth, but there are some important mistakes that you should avoid. A lot of people think that to do well on your exams, you need to rote learn and memorize everything, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Rote learning is one of the most time-consuming and boring parts of studying, and it's just simply impossible to rote learn an entire subject if you're behind. The truth is that if you're able to learn the right concepts, you can avoid the majority of rote learning entirely. You'd know that this is true if you've ever answered a multiple choice question by eliminating answer options before. To answer these questions, you don't necessarily need to know that one answer is right, but rather you can use certain principles to rule out all of the other answer options. And you might be thinking, well, this doesn't apply for short answer questions or essays. But I'd say that this is actually even more the case for these. Short answer questions and essays often require you to discuss big picture ideas or form an argument. It's true that you might need some important facts, but what's more important is that you're using these facts to support an argument that you're presenting. The point in me saying this is that if you want to catch up on a load of content, you need to avoid rote learning as your first step. The way that I actually applied this is that when I was going through content that I needed to learn, I was constantly asking myself if it was relevant. If I realized that the answer to that question was no or I'm not sure, I'd skip it and move on straight away. This doesn't mean that I'd never learn that information, but that I'd come back to it later when I had more context on why it was important. This leads me on to the next mistake which slows people down, which is starting from the beginning. Even though it might seem logical that if you're behind, you should start from week 1, it's much better to follow the natural compass in your brain. Instead of starting from the first week, have a look at all of the content that you've covered so far and think about what you'd be most interested to learn about. This might be a class that you happen to go to or something that you just happen to know more about, but if you're interested in something, you'll learn it faster, you'll remember it for longer, and that means that you'll be able to build the foundations for everything else faster as well. Now, the final step will allow you to be ultra ready for your exam. One of the best things you can do to prepare for your exams is practice questions but there are a few huge mistakes with them that people make. The major issue with practice questions is the reason I told you before to never look at the answer sheet when you're doing them. The problem is that when you do questions and then look at the answer sheet, you might be able to recognize when you get questions wrong, but that doesn't mean you'd be able to come up with the answer on your own. This is exactly what leads to that feeling in exams when you know you've done a question before, but you just can't remember the answer to it. The solution to this is to remove the answer sheet until you're completely ready to check your answers. The way that I did this was that when I did practice questions, I'd write out my own answer sheet explaining my reasoning for each of the questions. Once you've created your answer sheet, you can compare that to the official one and you can actually find the gaps in your knowledge and understand why your thinking was wrong. Doing this is what allowed me to cover 1.5 years of content in 2 weeks, and if you master this strategy, you can do this too. The challenge is though, you might be unsure about how to effectively apply this strategy, so watch this video to figure out how I study for 2 hours a day in medical school.